So I want to start everyone by thanking everyone for coming here today and taking the time out of your day. Today I'm going to talk and discuss exploring sensory design approaches for people with disabilities. My lecture today is going to be a little bit abnormal. It's not going to be looking into specific design, but we're going to look into the root and the foundation of sensory design. So as architects, our responsibility are to really make everyone feel an experience. So for everyone, with people with disabilities or without disabilities. So our world is very virtual these days, and we want to really just get to our basics and really understand our senses. So as I discovered through my research over the years, the touch sense is our most dominant sense. And so I'll take you through our installation and how I discovered that. So a little bit timeline about me. I was born on September 14th, normal kid. However, on August 2015, my life really changed. I suffered through many different health problems, and so I lost all my abilities to really walk and so on. And I'm left with nerve damage, which is neuropathy. However, in 2016, I wanted to really discover a new perspective on architecture, really understand more of how really architecture affects us and how it affects people with disabilities. So a little bit of an overview about my presentation today. We're going to talk about the stigma of disabilities, really what's advantages and disadvantages, the senses, sensory design, and my installation. So let's talk about the stigma of disability. So everyone in the public eye, anywhere in the world, there's so little attention to people with disabilities, and we really do need to change that. And as architects or as designers also, we need to really enhance our design by understanding that we're actually limiting our design by ignoring all those designing for disabilities, rather than actually enhancing it and using more design for disabilities, we're actually ignoring it. So let's talk about the American Disabilities Act. So at the very beginning, in the 70s, the US came and they did a code book that said dimensions and certain regulations for people with disabilities to access. However, the ADA did make a lot of people lives easier. However, it was not enough. And it was actually all based on inanimate objects. So for example, a door. They're saying, oh, so a door needs to be so-and-so dimension because a wheelchair is this. But they don't consider that actually there's a human in that wheelchair. And so if a human moves within that wheelchair, he needs a little bit more space to actually move around. So our current issues are actually facing those little codes that we're facing, is that they're actually based on the wheelchair and not based on a person on that wheelchair. So almost every person with disabilities, physical or mental, have actually faced a problem in their lifetime just because of architecture and just because of a design complication. A new concept arrived within the past decade or two, which is universal design. So this actually is a movement in architecture, which is making design for everyone. So not just for people with disabilities, but actually for mothers with strollers, for old people, and so on. So, and it really did help society, and it's being applied in Japan and in Asia mostly. So let's talk about the senses and what I'm trying to really connect both of those concepts together. So architecture is about experience. So you're walking into a house, you're walking into a building, you're walking into a park, a theme park, or anything. You're actually having an experience. You're feeling all these emotions, all of your memories are being filled with all of these different senses around us, and without us knowing, subconsciously. So the senses around us really make the spaces move. So Overall, our body senses, on the other hand, is what really takes our brain and we register and we store all those memories in a particular experience. So you'll always have people saying, oh, I went to this park and they had an beautiful tree. And so the tree might have been so huge that they person thought they were very small, and maybe the wind was there and the sun was shining and so on. And so that experience registers with us in our brain subconsciously. And so how I connected architecture and the body senses is by people with disabilities have a loss in one or more of their senses. So for example, blind people can't see. So one of their senses are actually not as strong as the other senses. So in design, we need to actually put those two together and really design in a sensible way. So talking more about like the five senses, how I discovered the touch senses are most dominant is because through our touch sense, we can really recall all our memories. So a brick wall, for example, you can feel the roughness of the brick, you can feel the dust, you can feel the temperature if it's hot, if it's cold. You can even sometimes smell the smell on it, and you can remember all those small details about architecture, and those small details create memories and they create experiences. And so moving on to people with disabilities, this is a great example of how blind people really interact with floor plans. So they really just touch it. But it's not just for also blind people. Anyone could really just close their eyes and touch something, and they can visually imagine it in their head. That's how the touch sense is very powerful. So let's talk more about sensory design and really what I mean about people and architects and designers using senses in their design. For examples, sometimes words elicit taste. So if I say something is delicious, you're gonna think of your favorite food and you're gonna start getting hungry. Sounds sometimes stimulate also touch. If you hear the wood burning, you can kind of almost feel some fire or heat. Some images evoke odors also, kind of like this picture with the candles. You can also almost like smell how beautiful that candle is, depending on what your favorite scent is. And then we also have patterns as one of the examples. Patterns actually in architecture cause dizziness. If there's too many patterns, it becomes a lot for us and our eyes get distracted. One of my two favorite books that I really based my research on are The Eyes of the Skin by Yoni Palsma and Sensory Design by Dori Muniz. Both of those books helped tremendously. The Eyes of the Skin really enhanced and really sparked my interest in senses in architecture. He talks about how the touch sense is dominant and how our whole entire life is really based about our senses. Sensory Design by Joy Muniz is going to be more talking about the history of sensory design and how in the 18th and 19th century, it was a movement as well. One of my favorite works of sensory design is by Tado Ando, and it's The Light Church. This church represents going through a huge, long landscape, but at the very end, whenever you reach the church, it is this cross in the very middle, and it's only made by light. So the image of the light and the roughness of the concrete really helps us focus and feel tranquil within the space. Another example is Deleuze Capido and Renfro, the Blur building. This was actually inspired by the inside of the ear and how it's very curved. And then they use light as like the sunset colors and more of blue to really make the person relax. The curves in this case make a person just want to lay down or play around. The same building, they also used this very heavy texture on the ground, and it's all almost sand-like, but it's not. It's actually very smooth. And they kind of take you within the sensory design. Another example are the pipes in Tashung Central Park. These pipes just emit water vapor, and they make the entire area feel cool and more relaxed. One of my favorite designers is James Tyrell, And I will show you a series of his work throughout time. At the very beginning, he started experimenting with light and how light really does affect the space and how our senses are just always focused whenever there's only one thing to focus on. So in 1983, he realized that the difference between the dark and the light, and really focusing more on the silence and how light really does affect all of our other senses when taking the hearing sense away. In 1999, he also experimented with more colors, and in this case, he wanted everyone to feel a little bit disturbed. Having the yellow and the blue, the yellow is a very exciting color, while the blue is a very calming color. So going through this hallway and while having the blue frames made you feel certain ways you didn't know how to feel. And at the same time, there was a sound of an echo of a hallway in the background. So it made you feel more that you were enclosed in a small space. And one of my favorites by him is the Baker Pool, where he makes you feel the touch sense through the water, the cold water around you, and just having light in front of you. All that you're hearing are the water pebbles and all the things moving. You're not hearing anything else but those little sensory devices. So more examples of architecture are Stephen Hall's chapel, and he uses light in the very corner and edges to really show his way of saying holiness and his way of enclosure, at the same time making you feel very open and excited. And on your right, we'll see also the same kind of experience, but they're using similar materials. So on both cases, they're using wood. The color in this case gives two different experiences, but at the end of the day, it's a place for relaxation, it's a place for meditation, it's a place for your sanctuary. And later on, Peter Zumthor did the thermal valves in Switzerland. And in these valves, they're just a series of pools right after each other. And in each pool, you experience the water going through all of these different walls and all of these different colors. And as you go through all of the different spas, you end up in a pool outside. And his idea and design is whenever you end up from nature going to seclusion, going back to nature, you're going to hear all of those little small birds. You're going to have all these little animals really around you. So you're going to feel more relaxed, while whenever you go into the spa and the pool, you're going to feel more focused, and so on. Another example is the Charles Garnier Opera House. So in this case, he used light and the scale of architecture to really emphasize how architecture is really used for making the human feel small in this case. And he used the arches also, and he used all the different acoustical designs to really make all the sound feel large and loud. In contrast, we have the Yoshima House by Takamiya, and in this case, he wanted the exact opposite. He wanted complete quietness and seclusion. So his materials in this case and design, they're all wood, it's dark wood. Even the floor is all smooth. The light is coming through, it's all natural light. And so in this case, you're bringing in also the nature element from the outside to the inside. And one of my favorite projects that a lot of people don't really know how it looks like from the inside is the Sydney Opera House. The Sydney Opera House's design from the inside really focuses on the curves and how to really make the sound more effective. So it dissipates from all the way from the stage all the way to the back. So even if you're at the back of the opera house, you will still feel like you are at the very front. And by that, they use acoustical designs to really enhance your hearing. So in transition of all of those sensory designs and really looking into the senses, I really wanted to prove in my own way that the touch sense is our most dominant sense. So in this installation, I call sense ability. I conducted a collaboration with Professor Wade from Texas Tech University, and Hector Isaac Guerra, also a student at Texas Tech University. We created 7 huge panels of 366 centimeters by 155 centimeters wide fabric panels. We got PVC pipes and we anchored all of the PVC pipes to concrete buckets. And we wanted to make all the people participating in this installation to feel small. So we didn't just want the kids to feel small, but we also wanted the adults to feel small. The idea and the objective of this installation is to really understand how people's art experiences are focused by eliminating one sense to enhance another. So in this case, I wanted to enhance the touch sense to really understand, is our touch sense our most dominant? So I took the sight sense away, which is what most people think our most dominant sense, our most powerful, or our first sense. So another objective or question I had was, what other sense will the people feel in this installation? And will they feel touch or will they feel another sense? So these are some pictures that I took. What I did is on each side of the panels, I pretty much made sleeves going on both ways. And the idea of it was to make people hug eventually. So on each side, as you guys can see, on the left side, you'll have kids with their family. There's some people that just had fun and they started making moves with their hands. There's so many people that just came and hugged and they stayed for such a long time and it was so beautiful. And then some that just kept playing around. And so the idea of it was really for you to experience and feel how you don't really need to see the person, you just need to feel them. And so this was conducted in 3 different phases and in 2 years. The installation really was focused on the person because in sensible design and for designing for disabilities, the one element and the most important element is our human element, is our main person. And so we are neglecting that person. So in this installation, I based my entire research on just focusing on the person and the human scale and the human body. And what sparked this installation was actually a quote by Ioannis Palsma from the book The Eyes of the Skin. And he says, vision reveals what the touch already knows. So the results of this research installation, 103 people said that their touch sense was enhanced, which was my goal. 37 people said their hearing. And this makes sense because in all 3 exhibitions that I did it in, it was very loud. But at the same time, you can still hear the person in front of you. And there was also live music in the background. So other than really eliminating the sight sense, people start actually to hear more. And then 17 people said that actually their the smell sense increased. And this part was actually the most interesting part because after I took all these surveys, I really wondered why people said smell. And so right before I did the installation, I made sure to wash all of the sheets. So whenever I actually smelled the sheets, they smelled like clean sheets. And so I realized, oh, people smelled that and they actually, another sense that wasn't expected came from them. And I was actually fortunate to have one person with disability come and experience my installation. He was a deaf person that couldn't hear. And he said that his touch sense obviously was enhanced the most. However, he said the second was his smell. He said that the smell of the fabric really reminded him of his own home. And so, in other words, there was still the smell came as third place. A word cloud from all the different words I collected from all of my surveys, many around enhanced senses. They focused more on like being happy, comfortable. A lot of people said they heard a lot of things. They felt warm, they felt joyous, they felt nice. And a little bit of more in the medium side, people said some of it was weird, some of it was wonderful and exciting. And then some of them, they felt emotional, they felt the skin, they felt other people laughed. And so going on more about how sensory design really does affect architecture in the end is that at the end of the day, all of our sensors are actually interconnected. You can't take one and say you're only focused on one. Actually, all of them at the end, they all have to be considered. So as designers, we need to consider all of these senses in our designs. People actually recall memories by the weight of an object. Let's say, for an example, your phone. So if you touch your phone, you can, without looking and closing your eyes, you can actually feel the weight of the phone. If you've been using your phone a lot, you can feel if it's hot. And if your phone case is smooth, then you'll feel the smooth texture around it and so on. However, all of these are based also about around our past touch experience. So when we're kids, we experience all of these different touch and materials that whenever we're older, we kind of forget about them, or we say, we already know how that feels. If you look from afar away and you see a tree, you're like, I know how a tree feels, the leaves and trunk and everything. But as adults, we don't really realize that all of these little things affect everyone else, especially people with disabilities. So using sensory design in all of our design can actually elevate our experiences and create lasting moments for people visiting our architecture. So in conclusion, spaces are always felt and they're always sensed. So if you're there going through an experience, you need to consider all of the senses. Whenever you're designing anything, you need to consider not only if something is beautiful or aesthetically pleasing, however, you also need to consider how that will affect the heat of the building, how also the materials of your building will affect your overall audience experience. If you have smooth wood, is completely different than having rough concrete. People don't need to necessarily go and touch your architecture to really understand how the architecture really makes them feel. If you go into a cave and you're not comfortable being in small spaces, no matter what material you're going to use, you're still going to be feeling small. However, if you add a smooth material to the surface, the person's going to feel better. If you add rocks and so on, the person will automatically feel that they're enclosed and they feel like that they're trapped. So we always have to think about how our touch sense comes from our memory and from time and space. And we need to really understand how all of those materials can really affect us. So in conclusion, the touch sense can be utilized in the architecture design to enhance the experience for people, but especially for people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Architect Leanne, for an eye-opening presentation. Actually, I was always I've always had ADA and accessibility in mind, but what have actually brought more of my attention to it was an exercise that I've conducted during my undergrads, where our professors had us walk or sorry, sit in a wheelchair and like ride it all around campus for an hour. Like each student had to do it for an hour, and the amount of struggle that we went through and the ache that we had in our muscles only for an hour that was, and it was unbearable, to be honest. So uh, ADA is definitely doing a lot of good things towards design, and sensibility is of the utmost importance when it comes to design nowadays. Yeah, so thank you again. The questions or the question window is open for anyone who has anything to share or to ask. You guys can raise your hands. Well, I take it that the audience really are gonna endorse sensibility in their design from now on. If there's no questions to be asked.
Great.
Well, Mrs. Leanne, if I may, I have a question of my own.
Yes, please.
During your exhibition or the installment that you've made, um, were there any people that um, were on wheelchairs per se, like how did their experience translate
Yeah,
in
I actually had a specific panel for people with disabilities, so I had the sleeves
okay.
very low, and at the same time, I also used a kid's kind of height on the other hand, on the other
Yeah.
side. But unfortunately, I didn't have anyone in the audience that came with a wheelchair, unfortunately.
Yeah, because it would have been interesting to see how their experience would have translated. Okay,
Exactly. Hoping for that.
we have a question from Amir Jabir. Mr. Amir, you have the mic now.
السلام عليكم.
Alaikum salam.
Can I speak Arabic?
Yeah, please. تفضل.
شكرا. هو حضرتك المحاضرة طبعا بتاعت حضرتك كويسة جدا، والصراحة يعني بتفرض رأيي، يعني احنا كمعماريين مش بناخد بالنا منه، حتى أنا كطالب برضو مش باخد بالي منه قوي، اللي هو جزء المعاقين. بس أنا عايز أتكلم في مشكلة معينة، إزاي إن الأسلوب بتاع المعاقين دايما بالنسبة لي أنا في المهنية مشروع بياخد مني مساحة كبيرة جدا، عشان من المشروع، عشان اللي هو يبقى مصمم بطريقة صح. فإزاي نقدر نعالج المشكلة دي في ظل إن الرمب نفسه ما ياخدش مساحه كبيره، وفي نفس الوقت يبقى مناسب للمعاقين.
ايوه. في النهاية انت لازم برضو تشوف، يعني هذه برضو اللي هي الفن حقت الاركيتكتشر. في عندك architecture، البيت كله في اليابان يكون 3 متر، وفي at the same time it's ADA accessible. انت في النهاية لازم برضو تشوف طرق تستخدم المكان والمساحة في أكثر من واحد شيء. For example مثلا لو في غرفة المعيشة تخلي غرفة المعيشة مفتوحة وكبيرة، بس نفس الوقت في أوقات معينة زي كذا وقت الطعام تنزل طاولة من الجدار. ففي أشياء أنت تقدر تروح حوالينها وتستخدم المساحة في أكثر من واحد شيء، أو تستخدم المكان لأكثر من واحد غرض. وساعات يعني برضو في النهاية مو ترى تاخذ مساحة كبيرة. لو أنت تبدأ أصلاً with مثلاً some of the ADA codes، مثلاً تعرف الديمنشنز حقتك من البداية، وتبدأ your design with those المقاسات هذه المعينة. بعدين أصلاً لما حتبدأ تعمل ديزاين تحط السبيسز، خلاص أنت عارف بالضبط فين المكان، كيف المساحة، لو في رامب، لو في stairs وتحتاج تسوي مثلاً رامب، أو لو في مثلا سلوب زي كده برضو كيف حتروح، أو تخلي مثلا كل واحد يدخل البيت أو building and so on. So لو نبدأ أصلا نحن نحط من بالنا في البداية إنه مثلا دي الأماكن أو الأسياب أو الشوارع حتاخد مساحة أكبر، فلو بدأنا من البداية منها حيكون مرة أسهل لنا لما نصمم مثلا الغرف أو نحط الجدران and so on. I hope that answered your question.
شكرا لمداخلتك أستاذ عامر. We also received another question. It is somewhat related to the question that Mr. Amir's intervention. How does ADA or accessibility affect you during your design process? So you've answered the fact that it's a priority, but if I may add to that question, when does it come? Is it the first thing that you think of and then you build your design around it? Or does it come as a consideration later on?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question, just because I studied in the US, and in almost every studio in our bachelor's and in our master's, our professors at the middle of our design or halfway through our semester, they're telling us, oh, don't forget you need an ADA bathroom, or don't forget you need a ramp because you have 5 stairs. And so this automatically makes all the designers and students feel like ADA is taking up a lot of their space, or ADA is really, all of the different dimensions are taking up a lot of their design. And so they have to change their design to really make space for those dimensions. However, if from the beginning we teach, professors teach that every student really does need to consider this in every design, because at the end of the day, it's our responsibility as architects that in our buildings or in all of our designs, it accommodates for people with disabilities. When I was living in the US when I was in a wheelchair, going around or leaving the house was a lot easier than when I actually experienced the wheelchair here in Saudi Arabia. When I experienced the wheelchair here, I actually didn't want to leave my house at all because I just knew I'm going to have so many different problems just leaving my house alone to go into the car. So there's actually not a lot of emphasis on really designing for people with disabilities from the very beginning of the design. So you need to consider it at the very beginning before you start designing all of your spaces, and then you have to change everything again.
Noted. Another question came in, and could you please give us any tips when it comes to designing public buildings, taking into consideration people with disabilities? What are the main topics that we need to focus on? Is it dimensions, ergonomics? What exactly
I
is
think
the main criteria?
the most important really aspect for designing with disabilities at the very beginning, especially for public buildings for this question, is yes, dimensions, but at the same time, we need to consider not only dimensions for maybe a wheelchair, but just general dimensions in your landscape and general accessibility. So there's a difference between accessibility and the difference between mobility. So accessibility is something that you can access, that you can go through. Let's say if there's a ramp, you can access through the ramp and you can go through it with a wheelchair. However, it's different than being mobile. Being mobile means that you're actually going through all of these spaces in a comfortable way. You are easily being able to go around and transport without any sudden turns or any different angles and so on. So one of the other than dimensions that's very important for designing for disabilities, I think also materiality is a huge thing. So really considering materials in our design. For example, I feel anyone can design anything on the walls and they can do crazy things in all different materials. However, when it comes to the ground, that's a whole different thing. When I was on the wheelchair, one of the things that I hated the most was going on the end of the ramp and you see those little half bubbles that really kind of stop the ramp. When I looked up and I did my research about why really those little things are on the ground at the end of each ramp, it's actually because for blind people, they have that, which is just showing blind people that this is the end of the street. So in this case, ADA doesn't really necessarily help our design in this case. At the end, the foundation of this code and so on is really having a texture change. So instead of having those little small bubbles that make the wheelchair rock and the wheelchair feel not smooth, or anyone really walking to be disturbed, we can actually just make different materials at the end of each road that is rough, and any person that is blind can actually feel it because their touch sense is extremely high compared to all of their other senses. So another, I guess, aspect is really focusing on ground materiality as well.
I believe that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much, Architect Leanne. You've been a pleasure to have, and you've definitely have insight. It gave us some insightful ideas when it comes to sensibility in design. Thank you, our audience, and thank you again, Ms. Leanne, for your awesome presentation.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Definitely. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.